From Utah Public Radio, this is Undisciplined. I'm Matthew LaPlante. I need to start today's episode with a bit of a disclaimer. In 2018, when this program was just getting started, we broadcast a discussion about what was then a new report published in the international medical journal, The Lancet, that concluded there is, in fact, no level of alcohol consumption that can be deemed healthy. Now, that flew in the face of what a lot of us had heard for a long time, and even what many of us had been told by our doctors, that a little bit of alcohol in moderation could be good for our hearts. But what that study and an increasing number of others have concluded is that even if it was true that some alcohol could be good for one specific aspect of our health, the cumulative effect of alcohol consumption at any level is detrimental. Not long after that program aired, I had my last drink. And I do want to be clear here. I don't have any problem with adults making adult decisions about what they do with their bodies. I'm not a prohibitionist, but I have become a bit of an evangelist. And when I'm not hosting this program, you can often find me bartending at 1833 Craft, which is a zero alcohol cocktail bar I own in Salt Lake City. So let's be honest, I'm really not a neutral observer today. I would love to know that this conversation helps someone decide to do what I did about 7 years ago when I ended my relationship with alcohol for good. But also, whether you drink or not right now, and whether you do so or not after this conversation, I think you're going to find it interesting. Because Charles Knowles certainly isn't coming after alcohol as a moral crusader. Knowles is, however, admittedly someone who is a recovering alcoholic, and he's also a consulting surgeon, a professor of surgery at Queen's Mary University, and the chief academic officer at the Cleveland College in London. He has authored more than 300 peer-reviewed medical studies, and he simply wants to help create a world in which anyone, even doctors, should feel safe to discuss their own relationship with alcohol without fear of social or professional ramifications. Because that, he figures, is the best way to help people make informed decisions about how that relationship will progress from this point in their lives forward. Charles Knowles, welcome.
Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be on your show.
Charles, you waste no time in this book bringing your readers into a devastatingly sad and scary time in your life. It was a day about a decade ago in which you were sitting at a table nursing a hangover with a bottle of rum on the table and something else. There was something else on the table. Can you talk about that?
Yes, yes, it was a time I was in Florida on holiday with the family, and it was the culmination of several days of drinking. And not for the first time, I was suicidal, and I sat there at that table nursing both the bottle of rum and a handgun that was owned by my friend who owned the house in Florida.
Charles, how hard was it to write that paragraph?
I mean, it wasn't the first paragraph I wrote, and my head had been in the idea of the book and the story for some time, and I think it just felt natural that the truth had to be told, and much of the book is centered around the idea that of why me, why this happened to me and not to many other people I know. And I think to tell the why me story and to investigate what the risk factors are that made me end up where I did, I had to tell my story.
Yeah. And you don't want others to be in that same kind of situation. I really gather that you want people to feel seen as well if they are in those sorts of situations. But you also make very clear that you don't feel like being a zealot about alcohol is the best strategy for helping others find an off ramp. Why is zealotry not the best move here?
I'm not anti alcohol. I think alcohol's had a place in society We've been deliberately manufacturing it for 15,000 years, and humans and our pre human ancestors have been consuming alcohol in one form or another for several million years. There's a good reason for that. People learn to like the experience of drinking alcohol because it results in having a good time. And I don't want to stop that. Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that people who have any level of dependence on alcohol will simply just not be receptive to someone preaching to them about drinking.
You still visit the pub on occasion? Do you have a neighborhood pub? Do you have a favorite pub that you go to? And when you're there, what is that experience like for you now?
I go to the pub quite often. I mean, I play music professionally as well, so I'm often in venues that serve alcohol.
Yeah, you wrote in the book that you're in a weird position now where people are giving you free alcohol if you wanted it.
Yes, ironically, no, I don't find going to the pub a problem, nor do I find sitting with friends who are drinking alcohol a problem. There's an important point to be made there that willpower is no defense against alcohol. So our thinking has to change to a point where someone like me can be neutral around alcohol and it just isn't a problem.
Yeah. What do you drink when you go to the pub? Are you nursing a non-alcoholic beer? Do you just drink water?
For many years, I drank Diet Coke and other similar drinks. But actually, after a good few years in sobriety, I have started drinking some of the available non alcoholic drinks, i.e., in the sense that drinks that seek to mimic alcohol. So they make a nice alternative to drinking things like Diet Coke, provided they don't induce in a person a desire to have the real thing. Then I don't think that's a problem. And in fact, my wife, who's now been alcohol free for 4 years, it's a pity we didn't know about your place in Salt Lake City. We passed through there. We'd have come in, the two of us.
You were always welcome the next time you were coming through my neck of the woods. You had your first beer at a very famous 500-year-old pub in Munich, the Halfbräu House. You were 13 years old. You returned there a few years ago. What was that like after the adventure with alcohol that you have had?
Well, interestingly, I was able to remember it. I mean, I even went back to the table that I think we sat at when I was 13 with a number of my friends and a couple of the school prefects who had taken us there all those years later. And I actually had my photograph taken outside because, in a way, it was a sort of important moment to look back on a life that had been shaped by 30 years of drinking.
Can you talk a little bit about what happens in the brain of a 13-year-old boy, or for that matter, in the brain of anyone when they first begin introducing alcohol into their bodies?
Yes, I can. One of the points I emphasize in the book is that we learn to drink. So maybe starting with a bit of neuroscience, if I'm permitted.
Absolutely.
When we drink alcohol, the alcohol's absorbed in the stomach and the small intestine. It goes into the bloodstream. It very effectively crosses the blood brain barrier. And there it has access to the nerve cells in our brain, where it affects the release and the receptiveness of our chemical switches in the brain to several what's called neurotransmitters. A neurotransmitter is one of many chemicals that turn the switches in our brain on and off. That's the connections between individual brain cells. And there are about 80 neurotransmitters in the human brain, and alcohol remarkably affects five or six significantly, which is quite unlike any other drug. And that has a number of effects. But from the point of view of having fun and a good time, it is the effects of alcohol on endorphins, GABA, and ultimately dopamine that lead to its rewarding effects, which are both psychostimulatory and relaxant. And it's why many of us like drinking. And when we experience that, coming back to the learning aspect, that feeling, a good feeling, is something that we will tend to repeat by a process that's called in behavioral psychology reinforcement. If you do something and the outcome of that is good, there is a tendency to memorize that experience and to do it again. In my early experience of drinking, at least regularly from the age of 17, I loved it. And seemingly all the woes in my life, I was at boarding school at the time, I was a bit of a nerdy, unpopular, socially awkward teenager at the time, and alcohol changed me. And not unsurprisingly, if that happens, that's deeply memorized as being a very positive outcome. And we learn to do it again.
And this connection that we build in our brains, this thing that we have learned when we learn to drink, is so powerful that it can overrule what we might otherwise think of as logical thinking. It can overcome those times that we have such a bad experience with alcohol that the rational mind would say, okay, I'm never drinking again.
Looked at from the point of view of how we generally think of human thinking as being superior to our animal relatives, you would think that we could make a reasonable job of making that choice. The reality is actually that we're not very good at making choices. And in fact, most of our choices are governed by intuition, hunch thinking, rather than the application of logic. And that's because the brain is wired that way. And it's this is a question of ancient biology overriding the larger cortex in humans, the brain power that we often talk about. The reward pathway and these survival functions are there to deliberately override other areas of the brain to preserve our safety. The problem is that those sort of jungle functions serve really no useful purpose in modern society, but it's those functions that are initiated by alcohol and other drugs.
Which makes this a deep and ancient impulse, and one that is not the same for everyone. You make this point in the book too. A shot of whiskey for a person who has one variant of a gene that codes for an enzyme that breaks down alcohol in our bodies could be very different from a shot of whiskey for people who have a different variant of that same gene. That presents some degree of complexity that really defies one size fits all advice about how much a person can and should drink. And it makes keeping up with your friends at the pub a game that is, well, it's like a game that's played on a very uneven pitch.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unravel in what you just said there. It's all completely true. If we take the drinking scales, there are people who gain more on the pros side than the cons side. We vary. And it comes down to a thing called the biphasic curve. If you plot the effects of alcohol against rising blood concentrations, most people will have the psychostimulatory, these good effects and relaxant effects, to a certain point, and then experience sedative effects and other effects of drunkenness like nausea and vomiting, etc. And that biphasic curve varies between people. And there are people who genetically are frankly intolerant to alcohol because of genetic alterations in the structure of their liver enzymes. So we're not all biologically the same. And that has been explored genetically, not just in the context of people who are intolerant to alcohol, but also for people like me who, from the very start of their drinking, got an enormous amount of psychostimulation from alcohol and seemed extremely tolerant of it. You can model that in mice. So there are genes in mice which can either be selectively bred or deliberately genetically modified, which make a mouse into a drinking champion. And such mice will prefer alcohol in a way that other mice don't.
It's so fascinating to think that there are those among us, you as one example, who are sort of primed genetically to not notice the problem as it materializes and expands in their life because you could always walk home.
The problem is, of course, that it's not just a question of not noticing, these are also risk factors for developing addiction. So by the time you've noticed, you also have the problem that it's much harder to stop.
Another problem that we face as we try to communicate to people the pluses and minuses of drinking is the undoing of the assumption that alcohol can be healthy in some cases. And this isn't easy because as it turns out, this is very, very old medical advice. I didn't know this until I read your book, but it goes all the way back to Hippocrates.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. It goes way back. And in a sense, when you go back in time, I mean, there's some truth in what people like Hippocrates and Plato said. And there's some truth that alcohol was used as an anesthetic before we had modern anesthesia. And there is the argument about safe drinking water. There was some truth in that, and really where we've moved to is that in the evidence-based medical age, we've started to unravel the other side of alcohol.
You mention this in the book. You note that researchers from the World Health Organization estimate that the harmful use of alcohol is responsible for about 5% of the global burden of disease. It's the leading risk factor for premature mortality and disability for people between the ages of 15 and 49. In your home country of England, it's a factor in a third of all accident and emergency room admittances. And here in the United States, it's a factor in about a third of all motor vehicle traffic fatalities. So while I do want to note and emphasize that you're not a prohibitionist, I'm not a prohibitionist, we also do need to acknowledge that it's not just drinkers who suffer the consequences of drinking. Our whole society pays a price as well. How have you come to think about that from a public health perspective?
Well, you're absolutely right, and the figures in America, from the point of view of societal cost of alcohol, are staggering. The annual cost of harms from alcohol is $250 billion. And actually, the biggest component of that is criminality, particularly the cost of housing people in the criminal justice system in your country. I think the first thing is we need to acknowledge it. And I think that information needs to be out there. I mean, if you compare alcohol with smoking, it's very well established what the harms associated with smoking to our health are. And this is not the same for alcohol, despite the fact that the harms related to alcohol are undoubtedly considerably more than related to smoking. But this isn't new information. We've known the connection between alcohol and cancer, which is comparable to the risks with smoking, since the 1970s. I'm not a zealot about alcohol, but I think as adults, we should at least be afforded the opportunity to see that information in a way that people can reach their own judgment.
As a doctor, I think you were aware of a lot of this, but you were motivated, as you've said, by factors other than sheer data to continue drinking. We talked about your rock bottom, but what was it about that moment or what was it about that time in your life that made you say, okay, now is the time that I stop?
I think, I survived the sitting at the table with the gun and the bottle of Bacardi. And in the morning after drinking, I just realized I'd reached the end of the road with it, that I could never, drink again. And I mean, you have to bear in mind, the audience, that this was one of many times where I had thought that before. But actually, on that occasion, it turned out to be true. That was my last drink.
There are several letters in your book from your wife, Annie. Um, in one of them, she talks about her own realization that her relationship with alcohol was no longer beneficial. That happened during the pandemic when she recognized that she wasn't actually a social drinker as she thought she was. She was someone who would sneak into the laundry room to drink by herself. And she doesn't say so specifically in her letters, but I wonder if you think that her proximity to someone who was suffering from pretty severe alcoholism as you did made it easier by juxtaposition to miss that she was beginning to have a problem.
I think actually, and I mean, I'm not saying this as an excuse for myself, but actually, I mean, that was long after I had stopped drinking and a very long time since I'd started trying to stop drinking. I don't think towards the end of her drinking had very much to do with my ongoing encouragement. I think where I might be regarded as guilty is in the earlier period of our marriage. You could argue that we selected each other
Mm.
early on. People select for certain behaviors that you do yourself. And indeed, the society in which you meet, of course, we met within the sort of drinking, drinking classes, if you like. The best times of our lives were spent partying together, and that involved drinking. I think the biggest problem from a marital perspective came when I had stopped drinking, was trying to stop drinking while she was still drinking. The removal of alcohol from our relationship took away the things that it gave me in the first place. I mean, you recall what I said about at school, that this was a tool that I used to socialize. And having drunk for all of my adult life, the sudden removal of that tool put me back to where I started, and that included in our marriage. It was very, very difficult that time because your relationship's built on it. The person she married was no longer there.
How close do you think you were to losing her?
During that 7 years, pretty close. When I stopped, then I was very difficult to be around. I sort of immersed myself in work. It was the first few years of it. Then I went to AA, and I think she felt that I just swapped my drinking buddies for a new group of friends in AA meetings, and I wasn't present for the family at home, in the same way as I hadn't been present for the family at home when I was down the pub. But I mean, the real problem was my mental state. I just wasn't a fun person to be with. And I think that she, at that stage, we've discussed it, said she was very seriously considering whether she could spend the rest of her life with me.
Charles, alcohol consumption here in the US has hit a low that goes all the way back to prohibition. We are teetering now on just over half of adults who say they drink, and that number has been falling very quickly over the past few years. What do you see in that trend? What's happening right now?
I mean, it's absolutely true, and it's true in the UK as well, although we're not down to half yet. And it's mainly being driven by the young. So the proportion of young people who are teetotal is much, much higher than it was. I mean, for instance, when I was younger, I mean, I didn't know anyone who didn't drink. And now a quarter of young people in the UK are teetotal. I think they are better informed. I think people are looking at their health much more rationally and asking, do I really want to put my body through the effects that alcohol will have on it? At the other end, I think there are probably more people in my age group who are recognizing that this isn't as much fun as they thought it was before, and realizing that there is an alternative. And there are a huge number of communities that are helping people to review their relationship with alcohol. And my wife's a member of those communities. Whereas, go back to when I first stopped drinking, there was probably just AA.
That's Charles Knowles. He is a surgeon, a professor, and a recovering alcoholic, and he is the author of the new book, Why We Drink Too Much. Charles, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on, Matthew. It's been a pleasure.
UnDisciplined is a production of Utah Public Radio, and if you happen to live in Utah, you can listen to us on UPR every Thursday morning at 10:30. If you're not in Utah, you can still listen to every episode of UnDisciplined wherever you get your podcasts. Public radio stations around the country have had a substantial cut to funding, so now more than ever, it's important to support this work if you are able. You can do that at donate.nprstations.org/UPR. Our producer is Maxime Dorian. Our theme music is Little Idea by Benjamin Tissot, and I'm Matthew LaPlante. Thanks for listening. Now go have big ideas.